I'm really happy to meet you. I'm kind of excited after watching your film. I didn't Google you, so I didn't know what you look like. So it's nice to see you.
You as
Um,
well. Thank you.
I feel really privileged to be having this conversation with you after watching your film, and a lot of things came to mind. I jotted down some words: inspiring, courageous, uplifting, hopeful, joyful, real. The work that you put together.
Mhm.
Um, so I I wanted to ask you, what brings you to this work? Um, how are you centered or not centered, or where are you in this work?
Yeah, well, so much of the genesis of this piece was came from me seeing a lack of comprehensive media pieces that were centering the voices and the leadership that I was seeing, particularly in Chicago. Black women's voices and trans voices and femme voices that I was very rapidly getting to know and understand towards the beginning of the production of the film. And I just felt I was building my connection and relation to the movement in a lot of ways because the leaders in the space were people that identified in many of the same ways that I did as a Black woman. Um, and I also felt at the time that particularly around the two police killings that were happening in the film itself, that I wanted to find a way to, lend myself to the movement. But I knew that I had limitations within that, and I knew that there was just certain paths that I didn't think would be the best for me. And so I felt that documentation of this moment in movement space from this very particular lens was something that I could lend to the movement that I was well suited for, and would still help it to grow and change in the ways that it wanted to, but maybe just like looked a little bit different than your traditional community organizer.
Well, it was definitely non-traditional, and I appreciated that because, you know, I think some of the kind of activism that we've seen, in the 60s and the 70s, some of
Mhm.
what we're seeing now is looking like what it used to be, where people are very actively engaged on the streets as opposed to writing politicians
Mhm.
and, those kinds of things. So you took on some pretty big um, issues. And I thought you managed it really well in how you weaved, stories together, and how the dialogue from some of the people in the film, particularly, uh, some of the stronger characters, really pulled out some of the pieces around systemic anti-Black racism. So I sort of experienced your film through that lens, systemic anti-Black racism. And then under that, um, you looked at the prison industrial complex.
Mhm.
Um, you looked at lack of accountability in policing and other systems, healthcare systems, things like that. And you looked at what the so-called war on drugs looked like and did to Black families, but you also weaved so beautifully in the intricate stories of, Black women, Black queer women, um,
Mhm.
and what was important to them. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit with me around how did you choose, how did you know it was going to work so well for the juxtaposition between Della and Janae? Is it Janae?
Yep.
Yeah, how did you know that was going to, because that worked so well. How did you know that was going to work out so well?
I did not know. I wish, a lot of it was, I think, just sheer luck and synergy, in what was meant to be for this film. But originally, I had reached out to Janae because she was at the time the co-chair of Black Youth Project 100 here in Chicago. And I was just looking to start profiling a woman in the work, not necessarily her, but then she started to tell me more about her journey. And at the time, she was about to enter she was starting her first year in her PhD program, and she was like 24 years old. So I was just, astounded by that in itself, that she had gone through a pretty rigorous, schooling journey already, and then was beginning a new program while also organizing on the ground around Black lives. And so I started to film with her originally, but over the course of filming, I started to meet over that first sort of season. I started to meet more women in the work, and also just like felt like there was room for the piece to expand. Janae has a very calm energy, a calm but very forthright energy. And so when I met Bella, I just felt like that was a really good counterbalance or compliment to Janae, because Bella is just so fiery and outspoken. Also has a quietness about her as well. But Janae is from South Carolina, and Bella's from here, from the west side of Chicago. So
Mhm.
also for that reason, I thought it would be interesting to have, someone that's a transplant to Chicago, kind of paired with a Chicago native. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, but I didn't know originally if that was gonna work out. But as we continued production, we interviewed a lot of other women as well that kind of briefly come in and out of the piece. But they were just the two that continued to rise to the top, and so we just followed our instincts, and it seems to have worked out.
I thought it was so interesting in such a complex way that, you know, Janae had her life in South Carolina, right?
Hmm.
Middle class, talking about her dad taking her to Paris and traveling and exposing her to the world,
Hmm.
and Bella talking about her mom, you know, basically, and then her mom later explained that she was imprisoned and then sent out to have the baby and
Hmm.
then go back. So when Bella was talking about, from her very young age, knowing that her mother was in prison, I just thought the two stories were so complementing
Hmm.
in such an interesting way because we can separate them, but the lives of Black people and Black women in particular are so intertwined, even when they are so far apart. They're
Absolutely.
so similar because then, you were able to show the struggles that Janae was having as a young Black woman doing a PhD. And it's interesting because I just sat in the defense of a 27-year-old Black woman,
Ooh.
5 children, who just defended her PhD. It was, I mean, I get goosebumps even thinking about it. So when I was watching Janae, you know, going through her process, I was just feeling so inspired and so happy for her because, I know
Mhm.
what it's like to do a PhD.
Mhm.
And then when she got the nod, that she could move forward, she was just so happy. But she also showed almost what, people are talking about, the imposter
Mhm.
um, positionality, almost as if she didn't think it would happen and she could be there. So like how you showed like this broad spectrum of the
Mhm.
lives, you show them partying and, you know, feeling sad and reflective and those kinds of things. So I wanted to ask you then, in just shifting over to Bella, in terms of her position. So Bella, and I guess this is probably, I'm going to ask you about this in terms of how do you deal with the pushback that might come from people saying, okay, so Bella is saying, for example, peace be with you, Salama Aleikum. She's saying,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times she's saying, peace be with you. And then, you know, she's doing a little bit of a swearing and
Mm-hmm.
she's using the N word. And so, like, have you had any sort of like pushback in saying, you know, why are you using the N word? Because, you know, the
Mm-hmm.
politics around using the N word, and it sometimes can obscure,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the point that you're trying to make, which is Black people are dying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't think I've had particular pushback around that framework. But what I will say, in terms of Bella's politics and kind of how she positions herself as an artist, as far as I'm pretty sure, to my knowledge, that her mother converted while she was in prison, and she has a number of other family members that are, um, from within the nation of Islam, or the faith, excuse me, within Islam itself. And
Mhm.
so, but for Bella, she also grew up in the hood. She grew up, in a part of Chicago that is extremely under resourced, and has major issues with policing and drugs and
Yes.
violence. But that doesn't exist within a vacuum. That's within a larger systemic issue that Chicago has with how it allocates its resources,
Yes.
especially on the west side, where historically is where we saw the riots after the killing of MLK. That's where MLK, very shortly before his murder, he came to organize, with sanitation workers. He was on the west side, and so she has all of that history kind of
Mhm.
embodied,
Mhm.
within this one person. And so that was the language that she grew up with. Those were the communities that she grew up with. And she still wants to have that connection and that relationship to the community. So I just think, it's not seen, in a taboo sense, within the community she comes from, and people that she calls family.
Yeah.
It's really something that, they have just accepted, and is part of how they, communicate with one another.
Mhm. I felt that too. I didn't feel that there was any pushback from anyone around. She was celebrated, actually. She
Mhm.
was honored and celebrated, and that was really beautiful to watch how that unfolded, you know, in pictures and words. In fact, Bella said she sees the world through the west side of Chicago. And she said she remembers when she was a lot smaller, how people could actually, and other people said that later on, how they
Mhm.
could actually go out in the streets
Mhm.
and do certain kinds of things and be safe. And she
Yeah.
said it's not like that anymore. So, but she was linking that to what you just spoke about, the systemic violence and brutality, and the under-resourcedness in in the South Side, and why people's realities are the way, you know, it is. I wanted to touch on some of the specific pieces of activism around the killings.
Mhm.
And boy, I like, my heart was in my mouth when they were at the police board meeting. And so, can you talk to me about that? Because I just thought it was so interesting when the Lori Lightfoot had a line in there. She said, "Sister, your time is up," and that just sent chills down my spine, because that's Black people are saying time's up. And here
Mhm.
was Lori saying, "Sister," using the words of the oppressor to say
Mhm.
time's up. Can you talk to me about that a little bit? That whole piece.
For sure. So yeah, the police board hearings are a big, moment throughout the course of the film. And actually, that was one of the first events I attended with my camera to start documenting for the film. And so they're basically these monthly meetings that happen at the Chicago Police headquarters. And it's supposed to be a forum between the citizens and this appointed police board that, deals with issues of police accountability and misconduct. Um, but the format's really interesting. You have a speaker list that you sign up for beforehand, and I think you have like 2 minutes max to speak. But for a lot of and it's a variety. It's not just about talking about police killings. There's a lot of other issues that come up from community members.
Yeah.
But it's a very tough line to toe when the person on the mic is somebody like Martinez, for example, is someone who has lost a family member from police violence. And so it just represents so much about I think police reform and the ways in which people are trying to adjust a system that has never really worked for Black people. And Lori in particular, who is now the first Black openly queer mayor of Chicago. I think, that line you said, "Sincere, your time is up," is actually really indicative of her administration and background. A lot of people kind of tout her as the success because of her identity. But there's a lot of empty representation within that. I think, it could be said that she maybe touts her Blackness or her queerness when it's convenient for her versus like what is true to her as an elected official.
Yeah.
And so, her having that responsibility at the time of kind of she was head of the police board and attended and ran all those meetings. She often just had a sternness about her, kind of like a no BS sternness. That just doesn't really bode well for somebody who's dealing with something as serious as losing someone they love to police violence. Um, and so we really just wanted to include that piece a couple times in the film because it's something that Chicago has been doing for a while, and I don't know how many people that aren't tapped in to community organizing or haven't heard of it before. I hadn't heard about it before I started the film. But I think it's an interesting study in what it looks like to try to reform a policing system that is so broken.
And you say it's so well in terms of how the system actually doesn't work. Because part of what your film showed is that even when you have Black bodies in those spaces, because the rules, regulations, structures, everything is situated in whiteness and colonialism and anti-Black racism, it doesn't matter who sits in those places, is that they will always carry out the duties of everybody before them.
Yeah.
Right? And so Lori said, it's easy for people to be angry and I just chills again, how you captured those lines that she said, people can be angry and people want people to be fired without investigation. And I don't think I didn't see any of that in the film where people were saying, fire people, police officers without investigation. You're basically saying accountability. We're looking for community accountability. And she made it look as if you were just griping and complaining that you wanted everybody to be fired for no reason. And then she went on to suggest that the work that you're doing has nothing to do with change and that you're actually not doing anything to contribute to change, but you're just complaining. How does that sit with you?
It's tough. I mean, it's interesting the point you just made kind of about, Black faces in high places. I have talked a little bit about, even within Chicago itself, at the time they were trying to get out the police superintendent, the state's attorney, and the mayor. all of which have been replaced by Black people in the past couple of years. But we're seeing still a lot of the same issues around policing that we were seeing when those other people were in their positions. And so I think that's a very accurate point, that it's more about the institution that they're being initiated into versus and you know, I think there's small subtleties, like the state's attorney now, Kim Foxx, has done major kind of adjustments in terms of marijuana legislation and things of that nature that the previous state's attorney most likely would not have done. But when it comes to policing, like uh, the progress is very slow, and I don't. It's difficult to quantify. Um, and with Lori, I just think, you know, her background is actually as a prosecutor prior to coming on the Chicago Police Board. And so she's kind of always been in that system of policing in one way or another, or in the criminal justice system. And I think that influences her deeper than she acknowledges. And a lot of what she's saying in the film when it comes to protest and you know, what seems like empty cries for change, I think it's just like a deep misunderstanding of the work that these young people are doing. You know, I honestly hope one day she can watch the film, because I think that people often see community organizers and protesters, for lack of a better word, as this like monolith, this huge mass that's just like has all the same ideals and approaches and ideologies. When in reality, as we see in Unapologetic, we are just these two people. There's so many differences and nuances between them, and so I think there's just a deep misunderstanding of you know, the call is, yes, we want to hold this police officer accountable, but that's rooted in a deep love for community and in a deep want for reallocation of resources that are being skewed towards police right now, when they could be going towards, you know, mental health services, education, you know, food resource access in Chicago. You know, there's just so many other things that we could be spending money on instead of the Chicago Police Department.
Yep. So that's brilliant. Um, so many more things, but I realize that we're sort of short on time. So I wanted to ask you then about, right when Bella was talking about her activism around prison abolition, um, and you know, there was a line there that really caught me about community accountability being an antidote for cynicism. And then there was a quote that says, "What are we not doing in the community to envision an alternative?" That really struck me in terms of what both of these young women were doing, not only, and you know, the different groups of activists to get accountability, but also they're envisioning an alternative. I really like how that sort of came full circle in closer to the end of the film, where we see celebration, we see joy, we see the so Rakia's killing, you know, there was some, maybe not atonement, but you know, there's some realization that somebody was going to jail, if only for a little while. At least that's what it looked like.
That was with Laquan McDonald.
Laquan, sorry, 9 years, right?
6.
6 years, 9 months.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
some 9 there somewhere.
Yeah.
and that Alvarez was no longer in the position. Rahm Emanuel, who was attached to President Obama, he didn't seek re-election. It like did people feel like your work and your activism and agitating the system actually contributed to some of those?
Oh, absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And you know, in a lot of ways, they understand that that's not something that the system would ever, you know, say. But in particular, like with the forced resignation of the police superintendent Gary McCarthy, that came after months of agitation and pressure that was being put on McCarthy around firing Dante Servin, because you know the police board could recommend that he be fired, but then it like kind of goes, you know, down the chain.
Mm-hmm,
The recommendations have to continue.
mm-hmm,
And so when that happened, it was clear that Rom knew that he needed to give us something, because it was very shortly after the tape had come out of the Carl McDonald, and
mm-hmm,
um, you know, just continued lack of accountability, and that was like a whole cover up that
mm-hmm,
it had been so long before they even talked that said that there was a tape.
mm-hmm,
Um, and so they organizers here knew that that in particular was a win that they had put pressure on Rom to bring
mm-hmm.
about. With the state's attorney, it wasn't we weren't able to feature it in the film because it you know, just because for time's sake and just so many other things. But um, organizers here had a pretty rapid response the couple weeks before the state's attorney race, to educate voters and citizens about Anita Alvarez's history with police misconduct cases. She
Mm-hmm.
was in her arguments before the Supreme Court and a lot of other things.
Mm-hmm.
They were dropping banners from like Chicago bridges and showing up at all of her campaign events. Just a very like intense, rapid response for 2 weeks, all led by young Black women and femmes,
Yeah.
that I, without a doubt, can tell you is the reason that she was not reelected.
Yeah.
Because before that, people did not know, myself included, um, about like there just a deep education about local politics and the power that a state's attorney has
Mm-hmm.
in even police misconduct in particular. So just educating people on that, and they weren't even saying to go vote for the alternative. They were just like, don't vote for Anita Alvarez.
Right.
That was an amazing win that they were able to pull off in a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And then with Rom, I mean, he had just been under a deep pressure for his entire tenure, and I think that he knew, you know, there aren't term limits in Chicago. We had the Daley administration was here for like 40 something years. But I think he knew, especially after the Laquan case and the entire indictment and trial and everything like that,
Yeah.
that it would be very hard for Chicagoans to trust him again.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, what, like I said, he would never say that that's the reason why. I'm sure it wasn't the only reason why he decided not to run again. But I think that pressure from community organizers over the course of his, I think, 8 year tenure, really kind of led him to step back. And so, yeah, I absolutely think a lot of those shifts were because of organizers, young Black organizers in
Yeah.
particular.
And I thought the the work of Black queer women and trans women
Mm-hmm.
in particular is that, you know, we're starting to see a little bit of that float to the top, whereas, you know, to say 4 or 5 years ago, these women were hidden and everybody else was out there. But now we're seeing, you know, these women take their place wherever they are. So I was really happy to see, for example, um, Janae with her mama
Mm-hmm.
and Bella with her mama. And, you know, Bella basically saying, come here and talk to me, you know, when they were having that conversation. Um,
I love how detailed your notes are.
huh?
I love how detailed your notes are.
I was so enjoying myself though, and I was like, oh, that's a good point. Let me write that down, right? But she's like, come. And then her mom said, oh, a chills. I mean, I get so many chills just even thinking. She said, I didn't kill anybody. I didn't kill nobody.
Yeah.
I was just addicted.
Yeah.
And so we know what the war on drugs did to Black families. And now we see there's no such thing as war on drugs and on white people who are addicted to whatever it is today. And I just thought that was so beautiful. Like it kind of almost like you just kind of slipped that in, but you had to be paying attention to see that you're making the connections with systemic racism and health and how that's connected to the criminalization of Black bodies and the surveillance of Black bodies in cooperation with capitalism. And it just so you made that so simple, but you know it's really so complicated. But when Bella's mama was talking, what were you hoping would happen there? Because I just thought, whoa, especially after the young people had said to the elders before that part of what's happening is your fault because you actually didn't teach us what you needed to have taught us. And her mama was actually doing that teaching.
Yeah.
In that space. So were you kind of thinking about that in that way?
I mean, I was just so happy that her mother had opened up to being uh, more featured in the film because, uh, in a big way, because of her history with the prison industrial complex and being incarcerated, there's a large distrust of people that you don't know, especially people that you don't know that are putting cameras in your face.
Yeah.
Um, and so that was, that resulted, like what we were able to capture was a result of many years of building trust, first with Bella, so that Bella then felt comfortable enough um, sharing her mother with us, because for a very long time, whenever I mentioned filming with her mother, Bella was like, it's not gonna happen. Like she just had no, she was like, it's not because I don't want it to, it's just because like she knew her mom and how because Bella's been featured in a lot of other spaces. And her mom's okay in a lot of ways, like showing up to support her. She's always there at all the shows to support her in events. But it's not always, prominently featured. So one, I was just glad that we had, been able to build that trust with her, and it's a big ask to come into people's lives for many years and document them as they are. So, in that moment in particular, I don't think I was expecting anything. That was the end of a series that Bella was doing. I know we said it was the beginning, but it was really the end. It's fine. It was a series of conversations that Bella had been having in intentional community spaces around prison abolition, or just like she had had a series with people with children who had had parents in prison, and just like kind of looking at it from all these different angles. And that was with the intention to, as you said, have a more intergenerational space where people could share about their experience and what they had learned when it comes to systemic issues around racism and policing, in a very casual way. And so that entire event was just, the conversation went on so much longer than, what we were able to feature. But, so I just think we don't often hear, or maybe we don't hold ourselves to hearing from people that have been in prison, or people that have been so marginalized in our society, even though so often we are claiming to be organizing for them or around their issues. And so I think that was a really important moment, because we're hearing directly from her mother about what her experience was and how she envisions the world without prisons or police. And this is someone who has directly interacted with that. And there's just no way, to replicate that. No matter how much reading or research you do, the direct experience is just something that you can't you can't replicate. And so I was just grateful that and proud of Bella for creating that space where so many people could have that direct that could gain insight in that way from somebody who had that experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Bella, she's so electrifying,
Yeah.
on so many levels. I mean, when she was explaining the barriers to going to visit her brother,
Hmm.
why she goes, and the barriers, and she was so meticulous in explaining that they know who she is. She's been to the prison before, but there was one tiny typographical error, and they barred her from seeing her brother. But even trying to go visit her brother, even though they're supposed to be allowed onto the premises, there's still a sign that says no trespassing.
Hmm.
Private property, no visiting, no trespassing state property. And I just thought, well, who is that for? Every single person that's in there. Nobody's going to go walking to a prison just
Yeah.
because they want to take sunbathe or something, or it's like, so who is that sign for? And it was speaking to what Bella was
Yeah.
talking about in terms of how people were being barred when they legitimately got the authority or the okay from those that are with the powers to
Hmm.
go in there, right?
Hmm.
And I thought, geez, like there's that big red sign that's saying you actually don't have any right to be here. But still, they have those black bodies
Hmm.
under lock and key,
Hmm.
So it was just like, it just really played like my head was just spinning around with that. And
Hmm.
then sort of like listening to Bella talking, doing her poetry, and she talked about, they're trying to noose us,
Hmm.
like that was one of the lines that, that kept repeated throughout. And so do you are you making the connection with, so the black bodies are inside the
Hmm.
prison industrial complex, so they're actually noosed, because a lot of people, as Bella said, and we kind of know, a lot of people actually don't make it out. So she was
Hmm.
happy that her brother actually made it to the next day, he was still alive, so are you trying to help the audience to see the connections with those black bodies in there that are noosed already,
Hmm.
and the possibility that even though those of us that are out here, we look like we're not noosed, but actually we are, like, you know what I'm trying to say,
Yeah.
like it seems like no matter where we are, there's a noose around our neck.
Yeah. That's a heavy connection. But I definitely think I think what we were getting at in a sense was um, prisons are supposed to be a place of rehabilitation, or at least they claim to be. And we just know that that's not the case when people can be under lockdown for 23 hours at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And aren't able to access human touch and feel and like basic things that we just need as humans to survive in society.
Right.
And I think in a lot of ways, um, despite I think we were trying to break up this understanding of what prison is, and what crime is, because a lot of people in there, yes, have committed, well, who decides what crimes are? But anyway, a lot of people have, by the system, have committed crimes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's when it comes to drugs and low level drug offenses and things like that, especially a lot of this is because of basic needs that they needed outside.
Mm-hmm.
Like they needed a job, they needed money, they
Mm-hmm.
needed education, but they weren't able to access that. And so maybe that's part of the connection, is that because we have set up the system in a way, or the system's been set up in a way where people cannot get access to basic needs. They
Mm-hmm.
find other means to get those, and then they're criminalized for it,
Right.
and then they're claimed that they're going to be rehabilitated for it, but really they're just being punished,
Right.
or punished, released, and still punished while
Mm-hmm.
they what after they are released.
Right.
Um, And so yeah, I think we're just trying to make I think we're just trying to kind of complicate the understanding of what prison is, because especially when it comes to prison abolition, there are obviously a lot of questions about what that looks like, especially for serial killer or just very violent offenders,
Mhm.
and how we kind of place that in our society.
Mhm.
But for Bella and other abolitionists, that for them it's not necessarily okay. Let's just open up the prisons one day and just release them all and just
Right.
free the wolves. It's
Right.
like it's like let's start to peel back on the systems that pour into this punitive process, such
Yes.
as policing,
Yes.
and let's reimagine what that could look like in it. So if we are building education and job training and mental health into our communities,
Mhm.
then people in our communities, when they have their basic needs met, like sometimes people literally don't have meals to eat every day, and people are wondering why they could be in a state of mind to go shoot somebody.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it's like let's start to reimagine that. Let's start to build that system so that we can slowly peel back away at prison, because it's not rehabilitating people. It's never going to rehabilitate people. It wasn't built to, and so we have to rethink what that means for our world.
Absolutely. I am with you right there 100%. I'm definitely think that the police should be defunded, but I don't. I'm the same way. I don't feel like we should just open the doors and says,
Yeah,
okay, well, no, we don't have any prisons because, as you say, there are other things to consider.
yeah.
Um, but I thought here it is. We're talking about prison and violence and things like that. And in one of the scenes, the police officer assaulted Bella
Hmm.
and says, "You touch my bike again, I'll punch you, bitch."
Hmm.
And I just thought, oh, we got 5 minutes. Okay. And I just thought, wow. And this is the person who's supposed to be serving and protect. And so, when when I saw that, I just didn't know what to do with that. But we see that all the time, right?
Hmm.
Um, so because we only have 5 minutes, I'm just gonna ask you if you could comment on that. And
Hmm.
then I'm gonna ask you one other last question about vision,
Okay.
and then we can clue up so that they don't have to run us off.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that moment was a perfect embodiment of kind of my hesitation about police reform in general, and a lot of people's, because you know police officers do not exist separately from their identities as people. In the same way, as a filmmaker, I am still a black woman within that space, despite that being my profession. And so I think that moment was a perfect example of, they had put up this barricade to stop the protesters from crossing a bridge that would go onto like a major it's not really a freeway, but just like a major street in Chicago. And people were righteously rageful, and they were persistent that they wanted to get across that bridge. And so I think in that moment of frustration or feeling that lack of control, that police officer honestly just like came up out of his body and just reverted to who he actually is, or maybe the power that he feels that he has or that he does have. And he felt in that moment, since his bike and his armor, his gear could not protect him or made him feel nervous, that he was going to use language to try to intimidate. Which is just kind of ridiculous because Bella's like all of like 5'2" and like I mean, she'll square up, but like she's, like you have all of this. You have all of this. And this is just people, like she said, we're putting our bodies on the line because it's not like we can come to protest with weapons and guns and all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really was just an attempt at, belittling the power that she was showing in that moment. And I think, the intimidation he felt. But I just think that just shows that you can't separate, you know, the influence that officers have before they even become a police officer, and how that identity and experience shapes how they act within policing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So this was a fabulous conversation, and I really appreciate you talking with me. So before you go off, I'm just wondering if you could just share with me, what do you hope that this film will do? Like, what do you think? What are you hoping that this will do for the movement? Or
Hmm. I hope that the film, right now we're seeing another uprising happening around the country, around Black lives over a lot of the murders that happened this summer and earlier this year. And so I'm hoping, with the film coming out during this time, that audiences can make the connection between what is happening now and what happened in 2015 and 2016 in Chicago, because there are so many connections there, and it's such a cyclical kind of, it's such a cycle that we're seeing around police violence and how police are indicted and held accountable or not held accountable.
Mhm.
But I think the strategic ways that young Black organizers here were able to um, bring about change and shift around that is really important. Um, and I'm hoping that, by showing juxtaposing these two stories of Janae and Bella, that people are able to see their entry point into the work. And like I said earlier in the conversation, I decided in a lot of ways to make this film because it was my contribution to the movement. And so I feel that way in this moment, especially now, that there's room for everybody, because this is a pretty big system to try to tear down. But everybody can't show up in the same way, shouldn't show up in the same way. Um, I definitely think that they should defer to people that have been doing this work and experiencing it for many years. But I do believe there's room for everybody, but we have to show up in the way that makes the most sense for ourselves. We're also still in a global pandemic. Like, there's a lot going on. And so it's important that we're patient. And, the film's been over 4.5 years. So I hope it just shows like what can come about with longevity and patience, and just being careful, and caring for yourself and your community.
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful questions.